Every security model we covered in episode 3.2 ultimately relies on hardware to enforce its rules. The CPU protection rings are what make kernel, mode versus user, mode separation physically real. The trusted platform module is what makes cryptographic key storage genuinely secure.
Hardware security is the bedrock. Think of it this way: software can lie to you. Software can be corrupted, patched by an attacker, or replaced. Hardware security mechanisms are much harder to subvert because they operate below the software layer.
And the Meltdown and Spectre disclosures of 2018 showed the entire inteen that even the hardware assumptions we built everything on could be wrong. Those are the vulnerabilities that changed how we think about hardware-level security, and they are absolutely exam-testable.
8 concepts covering the physical security layer. Stick around for the Meltdown and Spectre case study later in this video. It shows how hardware assumptions we relied on for decades turned out to be wrong.
Starting with the concept that everything else in operating system security is built on the CPU protection ring model. Let me introduce the team real quick.
Hey, I'm Michael. Honestly, I am hyped for this one.
Bella here. This one surprised me. I think it will surprise you too.
Hi, I'm River. I like connecting dots across different worlds. This is perfect for that.
Great team. Let us get into it.
Let us start at ring 0, the most privileged level in the system, and work our way outward to understand what hardware privilege separation actually means. CPU protection rings are hardware-enforced privilege levels. Intel x86 architecture defines 4 rings, 0 through 3. Ring 0 is the most privileged. The operating system kernel lives here and has direct access to all hardware.
Ring 3 is the least privileged. User applications live here. When your browser wants to read a file, it cannot do it directly. It must ask the kernel through a system call interface. The kernel validates the request, performs the operation, and returns the result.
Rings 1 and 2 exist in the architecture, but most modern operating systems, like Windows and Linux, only use Ring 0 for kernel and Ring 3 for applications. Hypervisors sometimes use Ring -1, a new virtualization privilege level added for virtualization support.
The hardware enforces these boundaries. An application cannot simply jump into kernel code. It must use a defined transition mechanism, and the CPU validates that the transition is legal. This hardware enforcement is what makes Ring 3 applications unable to corrupt Ring 0 kernel memory.
The security significance, malware running in Ring 3 is limited to what user mode code can do. Rootkits and kernel exploits attempt to break into Ring 0 because that gives them control of everything: file system, network, memory. Ring 0 access is what makes an attacker invisible.
For the exam, Bella and Erica, Ring 0 equals kernel mode, highest privilege, direct hardware access. Ring 3 equals user mode, lowest privilege, hardware access only through system calls. Hardware enforces the boundary, software cannot override it.
This is also why kernel vulnerabilities are so dangerous. A bug in Ring 0 code can be exploited to break the hardware, enforced privilege boundary, and give a Ring 3 attacker Ring 0 access. That is a privilege escalation attack at the hardware boundary.
Process isolation is how operating systems prevent one process from interfering with another. Quick question for you, Bella. If each process gets its own virtual address space, what stops malware running in one process from reading your browser's memory?
The MMU, the Memory Management Unit, enforces that boundary in hardware. Even if the malware process tries to access a memory address belonging to the browser, the MMU rejects that translation, and the OS kills it.
Exactly right. The MMU translates virtual addresses to physical addresses and enforces that one process cannot access memory mapped to another. The hardware boundary is what makes isolation reliable. It operates below the OS, so software alone cannot bypass it.
Think of it like apartments in a building. Each tenant has their own address space. The building manager, the OS, controls which doors open to which apartments. One tenant cannot enter another's space without the manager granting access.
Address space layout randomization, ASLR2, is a mitigation technique that randomizes where code and data are loaded in memory. Exploits often depend on knowing the exact memory address of a target. ASLR breaks that predictability, making exploitation significantly harder.
Data execution prevention DEET combined with the CPU's no execute bit marks memory regions as either executable or data only. A memory region containing user data cannot be executed as code. This prevents buffer overflow attacks that inject shellcode into data segments.
ASLR and DP work together to raise the cost of exploitation. ASLR defeats address prediction attacks. DP defeats code injection attacks. Together, they eliminate the two most common memory exploitation techniques. Though return-oriented programming evolved to bypass both.
For the exam, Bella process isolation relies on the MMU. ASLR randomizes memory layout. DP prevents execution of data memory. All three are hardware-assisted memory protection mechanisms that support the principle of least privilege at the memory level.
The Trusted Platform Module, is a dedicated security chip embedded on the motherboard. It performs cryptographic operations and stores keys in hardware, protected storage that software cannot directly access. BitLocker disk encryption uses the Trusted Platform Module to seal decryption keys.
The Trusted Platform Module stores cryptographic keys, certificates, and measurements. Its platform configuration registers, PCRs, store hash measurements of boot components. When the system boots, each component measures itself, and those measurements are stored in PCRs. Any tampering changes the measurements.
Attestation is a key Trusted Platform Module capability. The Trusted Platform Module can produce a signed report of the system's current state, the hash measurements of what software is running. A remote server can verify that report to confirm the system is in an untampered, trusted state before granting it access.
Hardware security modules, HSMs, are a different beast. Where TPMs are embedded chips protecting an individual system, HSMs are dedicated external devices used by organizations to manage cryptographic keys for enterprise infrastructure, certificate authorities, payment systems, and public key infrastructure.
HSMs are rated under FIPS 142. Level 3 is the minimum for secure key management, physically tamper-evident, with automatic key zeroization if tampering is detected. Level 4 adds environmental protection against voltage and temperature attacks.
The exam distinction, Trusted Platform Module, is on the motherboard, protects one system, supports boot integrity and local key storage. Hardware Security Module is an enterprise device, manages keys for multiple systems, required for high assurance public key infrastructure and financial applications.
Both devices embody the principle that cryptographic keys should never exist in software. Accessible memory as plain text. The hardware boundary is what makes them tamper-resistant. An attacker with full OS access still cannot extract keys stored in a properly implemented hardware security module or trusted platform module.
The boot process is a chain of trust. Firmware hands off to bootloader. Bootloader hands off to kernel. Kernel loads the operating system. If an attacker compromises any link in that chain, everything above it is potentially untrusted. Secure Boot addresses this by verifying each link.
Secure Boot uses digital signatures. Each component in the boot chain Firmware, bootloader, kernel 2 has a signature created by its publisher. UEFI holds a database of trusted certificates. Before executing any bootloader code, UEFI verifies its signature against the trusted database.
If the signature verification fails, if the bootloader has been modified or replaced, UEFI halts the boot process. The system refuses to run code that was not signed by a trusted authority. Bootkits and rootkits that try to install themselves before the OS loads are defeated by this.
Measured boot is a complementary concept. Instead of blocking untrusted code, it records what ran. Each boot component is hashed, and the measurement is stored in trusted platform module PCRs. A remote attestation server can later verify those measurements to confirm the system booted correctly.
The distinction: secure boot prevents unauthorized code from running at boot time. Measured boot records exactly what did run and allows remote verification. Secure boot is enforcement. Measured boot is detection and attestation.
Together they form a chain of trust from hardware to operating system. The trusted platform module anchors the measurements. UEFI enforces the signatures. An attacker who controls the boot process can control everything. Secure and measured boot together deny that attack path.
For the exam, Bella Secure Boot verifies signatures, prevents boot time code injection. Measured boot records and stores measurements for remote attestation. Trusted Platform module provides the secure storage for those measurements. All three work together as a hardware root of trust.
BIOS, the basic input-output system, is the legacy firmware that predates modern security requirements. It runs in 16-bit mode, is limited to the master boot record partition scheme, which caps drives at 2.2 terabytes, and has no built-in support for secure boot or cryptographic verification.
UEFI, the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, is the modern replacement. It runs in 32 or 64-bit mode, supports the GUID partition table which handles drives beyond the BIOS limit, boots faster, supports network boot, and, critically, supports secure boot.
Think of BIOS as a 1970s rotary telephone. It works, but you cannot install a modern security app on it. UEFI is the smartphone. The secure boot database, cryptographic firmware updates, and trusted platform module integration all require UEFI.
However, UEFI introduces its own attack surface. Firmware-level vulnerabilities like boot hole and ThinkPin demonstrated that attackers who compromise UEFI can bypass all OS-level security controls. Firmware runs before the OS. If it is compromised, the OS cannot be trusted.
The firmware update process itself must be protected. UEFI firmware updates should be cryptographically signed by the vendor. If an attacker can flash unsigned firmware, they own the system at a level below the operating system too, and that persistence is extremely difficult to detect or remove.
For the CISSP exam, River and Erica, UEFI is superior to BIOS for security because it supports secure boot and cryptographic verification. The key concern is that UEFI firmware vulnerabilities operate below the OS and require firmware patches, not just software patches.
The practical takeaway: in a secure environment, UEFI secure boot should be enabled with a custom platform key, BIOS mode should be disabled, and firmware update policies should require signed updates from the vendor. These are baseline configuration hardening steps. Side channel attacks exploit information that leaks from how a system is implemented: timing, power consumption, electromagnetic emissions, rather than flaws in the algorithm itself. Meltdown and Spectre are the most significant side channel attacks in computing history.
Meltdown, disclosed in January 2018, exploits out-of-order execution. Modern CPUs execute instructions out of order for performance. Meltdown abuses a risk, audit, compliance, enterprise condition in this process A user mode process can transiently read kernel memory before the CPU's permission check catches the violation.
Think of it like a cashier who starts ringing up items before checking if the customer has a valid payment method. In most cases, the payment is fine and the optimization saves time. But an attacker can exploit that brief window before the check and read data they should never see.
Spectre is broader and harder to fix. It exploits speculative execution, where the CPU guesses at the outcome of a branch and executes code ahead of confirmation. Spectre manipulates the branch predictor to cause the CPU to speculatively execute attacker chosen code and then leak the results through a cache timing channel.
Rowhammer exploits physical DRAM characteristics. By repeatedly reading a row of memory, you can induce bit flips in adjacent rows. An attacker in Ring 3 can flip bits in memory they do not have permission to access, including page table entries that control memory access rights.
The mitigations required for all three were significant. Meltdown required kernel page, table isolation, KPTI, which separated kernel and user address spaces at the cost of performance. Spectre required Repoline compiler changes. Rowhammer mitigation requires ECC memory or targeted DRAM refresh rates.
For the exam, Bella and Riverside channel attacks exploit implementation characteristics, not design flaws. Meltdown violates Ring 3 to Ring 0 isolation using out-of-order execution. Spectre manipulates speculative execution. Both require hardware, OS, and microcode patches simultaneously.
Here is your hardware security anchor. Forget everything else. Remember, this one, Ring 0, is the kernel, Ring 3 is user space. Hardware enforces the privilege boundary. Privilege escalation attacks are attempts to cross that boundary without authorization.
Trusted Platform Module is on the motherboard. It protects individual systems with hardware, backed key storage, PCR measurements, and attestation. Hardware Security Module is enterprise-grade external device for managing cryptographic keys across infrastructure at PHY PAPES 140 to level 3 or higher.
Secure Boot verifies signatures and prevents unauthorized code from running at boot time. Measured Boot records measurements in Trusted Platform Module PCRs for remote attestation. They work together, enforcement and verification, to establish a hardware root of trust.
Meltdown exploits out-of-order execution to read kernel memory from user mode. Spectre exploits speculative execution branch prediction to leak data across process boundaries. Both are side-channel attacks that required simultaneous hardware, firmware, and OS-level patches.
UEFI replaced BIOS and added Secure Boot support, the critical security upgrade. But UEFI firmware vulnerabilities operate below the OS level and require vendor firmware patches, not software updates. The hardware foundation can itself be a vulnerability.
Drop it in the comments which hardware attack concept is hardest to grasp: side-channel attacks, the Trusted Platform Module attestation process, or CPU protection rings. We read every comment and build future content from your questions.
Next is CISSP 3.4 Cryptography Fundamentals. Symmetric encryption, asymmetric algorithms, hashing, digital signatures, and key management. Subscribe and stay in the playlist. Cryptography underpins everything we covered in hardware today. Okay, it is quiz time. Let's find out what's stuck. Think through each question carefully before you answer.
Liked, subscribed. Good. Every like pushes this higher so more people can find it.
An organization requires that disk encryption keys be protected by hardware so that software-only attacks cannot extract them. Which technology best fulfills this requirement for individual laptops? The correct answer is C, Trusted Platform Module, a hardware chip that stores encryption keys in tamper resistant hardware inaccessible to software.
Meltdown and Spectre vulnerabilities allowed attackers to read protected memory by exploiting which hardware characteristics. The correct answer is A, out of order and speculative execution, CPU performance optimizations that transiently process data before access checks complete.
Which distinction best describes secure boot versus measured boot? The correct answer is A. Secure boot enforces signature verification to prevent unauthorized boot code. Measured boot records hashes in trusted platform module PCRs for remote attestation.
Strong performance on the hardware quiz. Here is what we locked in today. CPU protection rings give the hardware its privilege hierarch. Ring 0 is the kernel. Ring 3 is user space, and hardware enforces the boundary between them.
TPMs protect individual system keys in hardware-backed storage with attestation capabilities. HSMs protect enterprise cryptographic key infrastructure at FIPS 140, 2 level 3 or higher. Both embody the principle that keys should never be accessible to software alone.
Secure boot verifies signatures and prevents unauthorized boot code. Measured boot records measurements for attestation. UEFI replaced BIOS and added both capabilities, but UEFI vulnerabilities can themselves bypass all software controls.
Meltdown and Spectre were watershed moments. Hardware performance optimizations became attack vectors. Side-channel attacks require hardware, firmware, and OS patches simultaneously. No software-only fix exists for hardware-level vulnerabilities.
Next up is CISSP 3.4 Cryptography Fundamentals. Symmetric ciphers, asymmetric algorithms, hashing, digital signatures, and key management. Subscribe and keep the playlist going.
Think in pictures, and the answers follow.
Professor Erica signing off.